I'm really pleased that my latest book has been produced by Melbourne Books. This one's called The Lost Boys of Mr. Dickens, with the subtitle of How the British Empire Turned Artful Dodgers into Child Killers, which may intrigue you. But it's the third one I've done, and they've all got a common theme in a sense. They're about undertold or untold stories of Australia's history. So the first one was called Solomon's Noose, was about a convict who decided his future lay in becoming a hangman rather than being retransported from Port Arthur to Norfolk Island, and the story of his life and the crimes and the social history behind his life. The more recent one was The Prince and the Assassin, which was about really the first royal tour of Australia and how that coincided with the first portent of terrorism in Australia as well. Both relatively untold or undertold stories, and this one, The Lost Boys of Mr. Dickens, is of the same genre, and the idea came out of some of the research I did for Solomon's Noose, which was about convicts in Van Diemen's Land in the 1800s, when I tripped over references to child convicts, which I kind of vaguely had heard of before at school, in history lessons, which I did in Tasmania, but I'd never really looked at it. So I just did some Google searching like you do when you're curious about something, and then the curiosity became a little bit of research, which became a lot of research, which ultimately became a book. And really it's a story of how in Dickensian England, England was horrified by an explosion of crime on the streets, committed by young boys in particular, but also young girls. And there was a moral panic, if you like, in society amongst the middle and upper classes that didn't want these kids running around thieving from houses and orchards and pickpockets, the sort of artful dodger characters that Charles Dickens wrote about in Oliver Twist and a number of other books. And so its solution was to punish them and put them in prisons and then into prison hulks and then be transported to Australia for terms as long as 7 and 14 years for minor crimes such as pickpocketing or taking some money out of the till or stealing a pair of boots or shoes because they didn't have any. And these were boys sort of as young as 9 or 10 up through the teenage years, and they were sent out, as I said, for 7 to 14 years in exile, basically, to never return again, away from whatever family life they might have had and everything they knew. And when they get to Van Diemen's Land, the colonial administrators there had no real need for child convicts. They weren't strong enough to provide the free labour that the government wanted to build the bridges and the buildings for a new society. They weren't skilled enough to work for free settler farmers by ploughing fields or shearing sheep or whatever. And they were they weren't the best behaved children in the world, it's got to be admitted. These were kids who lived on the street and on their wits, so they were pretty profane, rude, insolent, do whatever it took to survive. So the solution then by the authorities in Hobart was to exile them even further to a place called Point Pure, which was basically a juvenile version of Port Arthur, which everyone's known about as a sort of hell on earth for reoffending convicts. So they set up this juvenile facility, the first of its kind in the world, a real pioneer and landmark in the history of juvenile punishment and reformation. And the idea was that these boys would be put on the right path, as they called it, through a mixture of strong discipline, moral education, which was code for religious instruction, and maybe some trade skilling to become bootmakers or carpenters and so forth. So that was the theory. About 3,000 boys were put through this juvenile prison. And this book, The Lost Boys of Mr. Dickens, is about 2 of them, who are characters much like Charles Dickens wrote about, as in Artful Dodgers. But once he dispatched them in his books to Australia, he never wrote about them again. So this picks up what happened to them. But 2 of these boys, 2 of these Artful Dodgers, were accused of murdering their overseer. And these were just young boys amongst a pack of kids who were around when an overseer was bashed to death. So there was a pretty sensational trial took place. This was a severe embarrassment, obviously, to authorities in Hobart and elsewhere, that this putting boys onto the right path clearly hadn't worked because they'd killed somebody. So it was a big trial. And then what happened was all the evidence that came forward ultimately led, without giving too much away, is that the boys got away with it. And so in that sense, it was the perfect murder. And they went back to Point Pure and their lives went on from there. So it's an interesting social history about how and why this sort of exile from the world's mightiest empire, that the best they could do for kids was to send them across the other side of the world and forget about them and punish them severely. They didn't get a lot of moral education. They didn't get much trade education. So they went from a dysfunctional life in England to a dysfunctional life in Australia. But the other interesting thing for me was in all these sort of undertold or untold stories is how much they continue to resonate today. Now, obviously, no one thinks about exiling kids and putting them in prison for the rest of their lives. But we still have the same debates as they had then about what is the age of criminal responsibility for kids. In different countries, in Australia or the UK, some say it should be 10, some say it should be 12, some say it should be 16. At what age should a kid be taken away, if you like, from the childlike innocence view to one where they're criminally charged with offences and pay punishment price for it? There's debates about whether corporal punishment, as in giving kids a strap or slap across the backside in school or home, that's largely gone out of our lives. But a lot of people think that a short, sharp lesson early on in life can do wonders. So there's debate about whether we should still have any form of corporal punishment. And then there's the question of their reformation and how can you do that from inside a prison? Is that possible, or is it a conflict? Putting them in prison often makes them harder and more criminal. And also the role of the state, as in if they're clearly dysfunctional families, as they were in Dickensian England where they couldn't afford to keep these kids and threw them out in the street, should the state step in? And should the state do it or should the courts do it? Who should decide? And so both in England and here in Australia, there's a lot of these debates just continue to reverberate. I guess even things like the asylum seekers on Manus Island is a form of exile and saying this problem is too much for us to handle, so we'll push them somewhere else. Now, whether that's moral or right or the best solution, everyone's got an opinion on. So while Charles Dickens is long past and the artful dodgers have long past, we have the same problems with street gangs on the streets, what to do with culturally and ethnically different groups moving into society and, quote, threatening it through their behaviour on the streets at times, the demonisation of them, the demands by the media and politicians for sort of tough action and a hard line on crime. These are all sort of natural human reactions, but I think the lesson of the book, in a sense, is you pay a big price for unintended consequences if you simply go for the easy solution of hard line, punishment, exile, push them away for someone else to take care of. So it's both a history book, but it's also a very contemporary book, I feel.